Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for our Big Ideas series with artist Odile Odita and our director Joyce Tsai to accompany our current exhibition called Awful Bigness. It's so exciting to have so many folks in this intimate space, so many of our friends and new faces for this program. So we really appreciate you coming and for your patience and getting everyone settled. So my name is Nicole Cromartie. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Clyfford Still Museum. And for those of you who have already seen our current exhibition, Awful Bigness, you know it features some of Still's most ambitious works. And the idea of our Big Ideas lecture series is that we're going to explore some monumental topics related to the exhibition themes. Tonight, as I mentioned, we're joined by artist Odile Odita, in conversation with our director, Joyce Tsai, on the topic of abstraction. That's a pretty big topic, I would say. I'm excited to introduce Odile Odita, who is joining us from his home in Philadelphia. We're so honored that he accepted our invitation to join our director in conversation here in Denver. Odile Donald Odita was born in Nigeria and is an abstract painter exploring color, both in the figurative historical context and in the socio-political sense. Odita has exhibited nationally and internationally in museums and art institutions including the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Studio Museum in Harlem, Cleveland Triennial for Contemporary Art, Prospect 4, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, among others. Odita has been commissioned to paint large-scale wall installations at museums and public spaces around the country, including Institute of Contemporary Art Miami, Newark Museum, the Nasher Museum of Art, Ezra Stiles College at Yale University, the Stanley Museum of Art in Iowa City, where our director Joyce Tsai once served as chief curator, just to name a few. His work is also included in the Venice Biennale. Odile Odita is a professor in painting, drawing, and sculpture at the Tyler School of Art and Architecture at Temple University, and is represented for the Jack Shaman Gallery in New York, the David Kordansky Gallery in Los Angeles, and the Stevenson Gallery in Cape Town. Let's give Odile and Joyce a warm welcome.
So I want to thank you again for joining us today. We met like years ago when I was a professor at the University of Iowa, and we had this incredibly intense conversation about abstraction. And when I was doing this exhibition on, these incredibly ambitious, large-scale work, and also knowing the work that you do, it struck me as a really wonderful opportunity to bring you in to have this conversation with an audience. I should also say something, this is an audience that is incredible. It includes, the longtime members of our museum, but a lot of artists and also a lot of supporters. We really want to engage you in conversation, and so save your questions for us, please. So let me just begin by asking you about when your first kind of experience with Still was.
Can you hear me? Yeah. That would have been in undergraduate school, just looking at the work through catalogs and being introduced to the work through the connection, or rather through the study of other abstract expressionist artists. There was a show that happened in the 1990s, I think at Mary Boone Gallery, and that's how I really got into the work. And I remember taking that catalog out of the library constantly. My stamp was one after the other in that book, and just poured over it. The spaces were just magnificent, even if I didn't fully understand the nature of those spaces. And it takes time. The work does take time. It is difficult work, but over the years I've been able to feel like I've come to have a better understanding, and even coming to the museum here, that understanding has been exponentially increased by looking at the drawings in the collection.
The drawings are incredible.
Yeah,
we have a collection of over 2,000 works on paper here at the museum, and these are works that don't exist anywhere else really in the world. And I would love to kind of hear more about what the drawings brought to you.
Right. I mean, for me, drawing is really extremely important. means of understanding an artist's work. It's the source space in the beginning. It kind of unmasks the sort of perfection that you might see in the final production of the artist's work. And so I was just like, naturally, let's look at these drawings. As I was thinking, what does a drawing to these paintings, especially the late work, what is a drawing like that? What does a drawing look like for those kinds of paintings? And so I was looking at the drawings and I was seeing, the mark making that was similar to what we can see in the later work in this, but with pastel and then with oil paint and then one with gouache. But when we started to go into the earlier work, and I really was like, I don't need to see that. I was thinking, I don't need to see that. But when we went to the earlier work, that was where something happened for me, where I really began to understand something about the later work. Images of Native American Indians in different positions within a space, the different contexts of that kind of living in these kinds of terrains. And then the close-ups, some of the portraits and so forth, the way that he would draw these faces in a very tactile manner. There was a kind of gestural mark making with the figuration that I saw, but when he would draw the faces, they were very tactile, very physical in the way that you saw the light and dark contrast, the shadow and light contrast, a certain kind of representation of realism in almost like a plastic or physical or sculptural sense. So, and then we were there, Bailey and, Joyce, they were saying, oh, don't you see the relationships and this and that, the connection? I was like, okay, well, I was like, okay, maybe it's there. But then you brought out a gouache or something, you just brought something out, and then all of a sudden, like, kaboing, like I saw it clearly. And it was like to see that the artist's focus was only a process of exploring its magnificence in how it could open up and expand in the different ways that an artist can understand space consciously and aesthetically. It was essentially the same subject matter, that these great paintings are these spaces with the Native American Indians within the Western context, let's say, within these fields of expansive space, of big sky. And that it was just a profound, for me to see that was very profound to understand that, but then just to see the fact that this artist stayed steady with the type of spirit and in different ways in which that artist can convey that spirit was just amazing, And so we can talk about we are going to talk about abstraction, and I want to be able to bring in, which I personally believe that abstraction has a reliance on representation or on a reliance on things in the real world. Even if we're talking about how can we represent an emotional state through the color blue. So abstract space, the color blue. But how can we talk about the vastness of this in the different ways that we can speak about it and still come to the idea that we're speaking or starting from a point of the emotional state of blue? So this is how I'm looking at abstraction and related to representation, where it's not a codex of one to one, but one to all, or one to its exponent. That it's not just this to this end of story, but this to this, and however we can explore that.
So I want to kind of go to your point about the ways in which abstraction is always anchored one way or the other, tethered one way to other, to our experience of the world in some ways in our embodied selves, right? And it's also our experience of the world in our historical moment. I want to get to the title of the exhibition, which is called Awful Bigness, and it refers to a line that Still uttered to Thomas Albright in a conversation, and he said, of his early years, Still grew up on a farm in southwest Canada, And that experience, he said, was really formative for him. And he said that that's where he understood and came to terms with the awful bigness of the land, man, and the machine. And, you know, I think, again, we don't really think of Still as a figurative artist at all, right? The works out there in the world, in the wild, are of that kind of wonderful mid-century moment. But I think what you're getting at is in seeing the drawings and also in seeing the early work, you know, there are ways in which the kind of that struggle, right? And also his experience of the land being radically different than the experience of the land that somebody like, you know, the French painter Millet might have conveyed, you know, that kind of lovely pastoral. None of that is in Still's early work. And instead, this work that's made in the 1930s is riven through with a knowledge that this land that you work so hard might betray you, right? That this land that you work so hard to reap something might not yield. You know, he was doing this, he was, you know, farming and witnessing farming in the midst of the Great Depression, right? In the midst of all of these multiple crises, ecological, economic, and otherwise. So, you know, when we went through the galleries and looked at early Still, what was your sense of them?
Well, when you spoke about that notion of the awful bigness, and there's a certain kind of way in which you can think about that word awful, in the way you spoke about the notion of awesome, as in, or the awe,
Yep.
but also the let's say the other side of awe, or the other side of the sublime, in relation to like cultural manifestations of ideas and constructs and ideas, and what goes behind the work that goes behind those ideas. But for me, when I'm looking at the paintings, and I'm thinking about the ways in which this artist is dealing with texture, and I'm going to speak about, I'm going to you know, jump between abstraction as a maker and then abstraction as a thinker. And as a maker, I'm just fascinated with these surfaces. Now, you have a lot of tactility and a lot of gestural mark making and physicality and all that, because it's not, and it's to realize that that is labor, and that's very difficult. It's just, we can enjoy looking at these surfaces, but there's a physicality that goes into putting that down on a surface, and a kind of strength, you know, physical strength actually to put that down. And so then you see this sort of tactility that goes against each other in the way that you have surfaces where there's shine against surfaces that are matte. And then you look further and you see surfaces that are raw, seemingly like just raw canvas, but then that you realize that's rabbit skin glue brushed on to the surface, creating a kind of another layer of almost invisible or disappearing paint strokes, but paint strokes nonetheless. And then you think of all of this activity on the scale at which we see most of the later work. I mean, Mammoth is the you know, it's not scaffolding, but he's getting onto walking up and down something to get to the top, and then get to the bottom, and then get to the left, and then to get to the right, all with his hand. So that sense of labor and that intensity and the way in which the term changes as you see the work, because you start to see what seems to be not vacuous but almost empty spaces, and you're thinking, oh, there's hardly much work being done. But then it's like, what does that mean to be able to actually allow that space to exist with some gestural mark, but then to understand that those different areas are giving different information, different qualities of light to the viewer as you're looking and consuming the information from the surface of the work. Not even pictorial, just materially, just the material information from the surface of the work. I wanted to say before, my mind runs really fast when I'm looking at stuff and thinking about stuff, so I need to just say this before I forget it. But I was looking at the gestures of his lines, the lines that are in the paintings, and it's amazing to see how there's a continual and constant upward, final upward movement in all the paintings, and there's a reference to the beyond when you get to the top of the painting. For me, I'm interested in that through like the idea of television and movie screens and the text that comes up at the end. You know, you have the end and then you have the credits that run up and then they get cut off at the top, but does it stop there after it disappears, or does it continue? And what is that idea of the periphery, and what's the idea of that space beyond the frame of consciousness, or let's say beyond the frame of presentness? You know, where is that space? What happens to that space that disappears behind you, you know? So you have that upwardness, and you have sometimes the line goes across, but then there's another way in which the line connects and goes back up. But there's that force of that kind of ascendancy that exists in the work, and there's that kind of exhilaration of seeing that movement, that power of that direction, that's that light that's in the work. In the brown painting that we're talking about the big brown one, and in that one it's super interesting because there are other paintings that do this, but that one does it significantly, where the lines actually start from the bottom and mostly all the way across, all the different lines come from the bottom. So there's a certain kind of groundedness that and that color. Again, we can talk about associations, and that brown maybe reminds us of mountain or earth or materiality or concreteness, in a way in which blues might allow us to think about atmosphere and space and lightness a little bit more. So you have that mark that's going through that brown, and so you feel, and then you have that green part right at the left of the painting, and so you feel like you're looking at a scape that's just like, maybe you're like not on the ground, but you're like looking at something that came from the ground, but then above it, but then there's a struggle of going through that brown space until you get to that upper section, which allows a lot of lightness or atmosphere in its own distinct way, because in all these paintings you're seeing up there, different things are happening, and that's what's really magnificent about the artists up there. He's able to actually, using methods that seem similar, get to different kinds of experiences or different kinds of understandings of how you can travel bodily and mentally through a visual space, through a material space, and then through this idea of landscape or space in the mind. And I think that that's what's beautiful about artists like this. Joan Mitchell is the same, in my opinion, where you can see a sense of the local, a sense of landscape in the way that it can impress upon us through color and that kind of memory of color in a landscape. But then that disappears in the way that the artist is able to manipulate the material on that surface, so that double connect between the mind, landscape in the mind, and landscape with the body, it does this magical thing of bringing it all together in ourselves as we look at them.
That's such a marvelous description of just the operation of, the interplay between the very technical, on some level, what is painting but simply applying paint on canvas? But it becomes this, it's transmuted, there's something alchemical about it,
Yeah.
where it becomes something else.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of miraculous transformation of something kind of like brute matter into something else is something that this generation of painters is really preoccupied with.
Yeah.
Now, I want to kind of switch gears for a moment here, and I would love to hear you talk a bit about your process. So, Still is somebody who is working between painting and works on paper, and is also, in that respect, any painter who has any sort of sketches or any sort of activity on work on paper is operating at a much different scale and also different embodied making, right? If you're doing something on construction paper, you're working horizontally, right? And with the pressure of your hand rather than the kind of large gestural marks of your arm. And I would love to kind of hear you talk about how you approach, the differences between making something on canvas versus making a wall installation are really quite significant. So I'd love to kind of hear you talk through how you think through these different registers, and also while retaining that sense of expansiveness.
I believe like an artist or a painter, they become better over time, and it's a matter of becoming able to understand those different things that come into play in the space of making things. So space and relationship with scale is something I had to continually learn, and I was maybe it's been a great thing to be able to have my practice become these different things in the sense of installation and painting, and then my drawing, and then painting on canvas versus painting on wood panel versus painting on plexiglass, which I used to do as well. But the notion of scale, it's an obvious thing that to paint on a wall versus painting on a canvas, that I can literally see that scale becomes something to consider. But you really can still, and this is let me say that I won't say the name of the artist, but there was an artist that we were talking about, an expressionist, like a very famous expressionist artist. I was speaking with Robert Bordeaux about the work, and they were saying, yeah, this artist, they made their sketches on like Post-it size paper, and then, not to be limiting, because I use Post-its all the time for different things, but the idea was that the scale shift between the smaller image and then the bigger painting didn't necessarily transform. And that's very important consideration, because you have to realize that scale is actually super important. The size of the work and how you're engaging the material on that space, in that space. I've experienced in my paintings that I have a color that's this size, and then in the same painting it'll be this size, and they become two different colors, for example. The same color can appear and seem to be very different just because of the nature of how it catches light or captures natural light when you're looking at it. So it's to be cognizant of the power of drawing, let's say, and how it can help you to manifest the notion of scale as it relates to space and as it relates to expansive space, or the staging of space in the sense of foreground, middle ground, background, and still does that very well in a lot of the paintings, in which you can see that in the same instance of the drawings where the figures are drawn throughout the paper, and there's a sense of, as it moves throughout the paper, there's a sense of the round, or the sense of the foreground with the background. Then you have in these paintings that same kind of similar relationship, whereas the figure is just, there's a gestural drawing in the paper. The paintings retain that figural element as a gesture, as a mark. And so you get a sense of the kind of way in which the figure becomes integral in the space through the aspect of gesture. Because let's say this is kind of technical, I don't want to get too technical, but if you're drawing a figure with the contour and so forth, there's a tendency of it separating from its background, like the idea of figure and background. But the way in which he's painting these marks, there's this kind of, and the way in which they introduce into the background space, there's this kind of symbiotic relationship that it becomes, or our eyes tend to then merge the colors together and create this seemingly like vibrant or vibrating space with all the different colors. So, but these are kind of things that what I'm talking about are things that I've learned by looking and learned by making. And I think that's what's also very important when we talk about the work. We have to talk about this person as an artist in the sense of making the thing. And then not only making the thing as an artist, let's say, color, palette, whatnot, but what is the time space, the cultural space, the social space of the artist, and how does that help to inform what they are doing with the work they are making on those many different levels that we can look at the work. So this is why, for me, not only just abstraction, but all art has that power because it incorporates so many different aspects of time and reality and a person's reality with other people. And it's very important when we consider those things when we look at an art object.
I love that series. I think part of what's really quite marvelous about the way you talk about scale is that you're also foregrounding that working at different scales requires a different set of, a kind of different acuity to relationships.
Yeah, my speaking about one's history, one's work's life, one's social life, one's like work in their studio life, that's scale too.
Right.
So one has to understand how we can talk about scale not only in this singular way or how we talk about things in their specific way, but how those things transform in other ways of understanding. So that is just an example of what I'm trying to say. When we speak about abstraction, let's say, or we can speak about representation, let's say, we can talk about the ways in which we can speak expansively and interconnectedly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, to that point, I think one concept that I would love for us to kind of explore and dive into, because when we say awful bigness, it's another way of saying the sublime, right? Mm-hmm. And from my perspective, the sublime can be described as this experience, or philosophically, and in the Western tradition, the sublime is something that's oftentimes described as those kind of experiences that push us because they feel like it's too much, right? They push us and make us, have a sense of being overwhelmed by the expansiveness or even terror, that we have that experience of, standing on the precipice of a cliff, and we have that kind of experience of the grandeur of nature, and we feel small in comparison, and we feel, by feeling threatened, but from a remove and from a position of safety, we can come to terms with both our abilities and our limitations, right? So the sublime is an experience that, yes, is overwhelming, but it's predicated upon experiencing violence or terror or beauty or wonder, always from a position of safety, right? Because otherwise, you're just being endangered, running for your life, and so it can't be an aesthetic experience, right? And with the sublime, I think one of the things that we find in artworks that we find to be sublime, where oftentimes, what we're experiencing is a work of art, obviously. I mean, that seems so obvious, right? But it's made by somebody who has had a set of experiences and has translated that and given it form, and imbued it with perhaps the danger that they experienced not from a position of safety. That there is, to a certain degree, in the making of something sublime, a cost that the artist bears, right?
Well, you've said a lot of things. I mean, it's like, no. It's like,
I'm a
no,
talker.
it's like we can talk about the sublime in the sense of how we can engage, say, notions of what you addressed in the real world, and then speak about how we can talk about how we can speak towards it as artists or as thinkers, thinking through that process. I mean, I have questions about the sublime when I think about, like, I say to myself, who's sublime? Yep. Okay, and how are they interpreting or imposing the notion of the sublime on another person? And then I'm thinking about, like, the idea of the artist as maker and engaging the spectacle of materiality. Because I'm looking at paintings up there that do magnificent things with material. And this becomes my awe when I look at that work. Listen, like, how is this artist able to do these things where the material and the color and the shape and the mark are doing more than one thing at any given moment, right? So that to me is like wonderment. And I'm speaking about then the sublime, or thinking about the sublime in this way, like where I'm made speechless by the skill, the technical skill and proficiency of this particular artist. So, but the sublime is something that I think is part of anything that we need to think about when we're looking at artwork. I mean, representation for me is interesting because I think this artist is highly conceptual in my opinion, but the representational work is highly conceptual too, because you're speaking about something, you're speaking about a thing, and you're speaking about the representation, the representing of a thing. So it's not the thing you see is not the thing that it is. And that construct in and of itself or that situation in and of itself is extremely fascinating. So like people look at abstraction and say, I don't get it. It's like, what is that nonsense? So what is this? Just like, like listening to jazz. Oh, it sounds like they've been tuning their instruments for like 20 minutes. Like what's that, right? But then you gotta, if you flip it and you look at, say, representation, you're like the hat or a shoe or even people, you're like, that's not what you see at all. And that's why Plato he thought artists were jokes. He's like, I don't even, God is the real. And this is Platonic, like ideal. God is the real. Trees and grass and animals, that's just a copy of God. And then if you actually are making a painting of that stuff, oh my God. You know what I mean? So representation and the codes of representation are fascinating to me because it's so concretely abstract in its own conceptual way. And there is that, for me, the interplay and the tie between abstraction and representation, because you have, in a way, abstraction feeds off of the representational or feeds off of the real in a way that it needs those things as an anchor, even if the anchor becomes the way in which someone thinks about something in their life. Just the process of thinking about something in your life and that's trying to make that become real and material. It's fascinating. And that's amazing. And in a way, is the figurative artist doing the same thing in reverse or doing the same thing through language? Because they're immediately engaging language and they have to go through a process of disappearing language. In a way, it's kind of easier to deal with language or the disappearance of language and abstraction in a certain sense. But abstraction can get caught up in language as well, or the constrictions of language as well. And so there's a lot of complexity and difficulties being an artist in that respect.
I think part of what you're getting at is just the enterprise of, when we're looking at abstract artists in the Western tradition in the 20th century, so much of that project was to absolutely overcome representation. Mm-hmm. And really achieving instead presentness, mm-hmm. And presentness and a concrete presence that you had to contend with, right? And I think the kind of work that you see upstairs, and also, in an entire tradition, I think one of the things that it forces us to do is to break our attachment to something as something else, mm-hmm. and break our attachment to about, right? And that you are confronted with an experience that you're gonna have to struggle to find the language to share with another human being. But that experience is also something that we are moved to share. Right.
Right. I mean, and you're speaking about the works have no titles, but what we see written there, like PH, was it PH? Yeah, whatever that number system is. And I think that is brilliant because it does allow exactly what you just said, for the viewer to come to the idea of what are we looking at and how can I identify this experience I'm having with this work. And on different levels. And it's so interesting. I mean, that's another layer of the conceptualism of this artist. I mean, the artists have spent time also replicating their own work. Yes. That there's an exhibition about that, specifically about that. And I think about that relative to an artist. I love Elaine Sturdivant. I'm not sure if you, yeah, Elaine Sturdivant. I hope that you can look at this artist's work. The person, I don't want to get into that, but just like the fact is that the idea of making a copy of the work, you know, Robert Rauschenberg had the project of you know, first off erasing a de Kooning, and then even earlier than that, remaking remaking a painting, or maybe after that, remaking one of their paintings. And the idea is, are we making something that's called a copy, or are we making something that's called a new thing? Yeah. And that's a really important situation here, because this artist, Elaine Sturdivant, I'll quickly say it, their project was to make paintings from male artists. And with respect to that, people might have seen them as copies, and that's to say then there's hierarchy. If something's a copy in our mind, we think of the second thing as less than, and this goes back to the whole Platonic idea, of which is why I find this artist so fascinating. But if we can look at the thing that this artist makes as something else, then that changes this idea of what it means, what value means, and how we can understand the value of things. And then it goes to almost the biblical in the sense of like woman as the copy of man. And that's how it's written, or the woman as the coming from the rib of the man, let's say. But this artist is making another thing. And I remember it was at Skowhegan teaching, working up there, and Michelle Grabner and I were teaching together, and I said to Michelle, "Oh my goodness, those things are not copies at all; they're new things." She goes, "Mm-hmm." I was like, "Oh my God!" And it's really important to understand then what kind of energy that an artist is putting into making another thing that looks like the thing before, but becomes another thing. And then what does that mean for us to look at that new thing, and how are we learning, what are we learning from that? And how are we engaging in the idea of what that thing is? And those are the questions, those big questions that I think make actions like that so important. Yeah.
I'd like to kind of turn back to the question of naming. And you do have titles for your work, and I'd love to kind of hear you talk about the titles for your work.
For me, the titles are locators in a sense of, they're actually for me. The titles are for me to be able to understand where I was thinking, where I was, in what space I was thinking from or coming from, and where I was putting my energy towards. And they then become, in a way, doorways or gateways for me to communicate with my viewer, to be able to say, this is kind of like the proximity of thought. We can have different ways in which we understand or approach the work, but this is my proximity of thought. And I can talk about then why I put that title there, and then maybe we can consider what that might mean in what we're, relative to what we're looking at. Yeah.
So I am actually cognizant of the time. I know that this didn't feel like 45 minutes, but I would love to open up the conversation to the audience, if that's all right with you.
That's fine.
When I think about Africa and textiles, and I think about the rich colors and designs, and could you talk a bit about your background, your specific culture within Nigeria, and how that informed your decision to do this kind of work?
Right. I'm Nigerian, and I'm Igbo specifically, but there were many ways that I came to this work. I mean, my dad was an artist. He retired as an art historian. I came to learn that he was the first Black Africanist teaching in the United States. He founded the History of African Art and Archaeology program at Ohio State University, and was educated in the Midwest. University of Iowa, graduate school there, and then went on to become a PhD in art history, working with the first Africanist in the country, Roy Sieber, in Bloomington, Indiana. I grew up with African art, amongst other things, in the house, and it became a way of which I could understand myself as much as like comic books. I don't read them anymore, but I look at them still. I look at that artwork still, and I look at things like that. For me, I'm informed by a lot of different things, but let's say the patterning and the graphicness of the patterning is very much essential to like the concept of dealing with Africa in a remote sense, in a remote manner. But I draw on Africa in different ways through sculpture, looking at textiles. I love textiles. I spoke about my love of textiles through just my mom taking me to garage sales as a kid and being able to look at materials and things and books and magazines and color and seeing the ways in which you can see color changing over different periods of time, over the decades, in magazines and these kinds of things, in furniture, in plates, glass. So like I have that kind of background in my work. And so for me, it's just been a study of being able to understand how color in its specificity and in its magnificence can point to things and escape things, escape meaning and direct oneself to meaning, and how drawing participates with color to be able to engage those kinds of fascinations and mysteries of visual information in that sense, being able to use drawing to hold space but break space, and using color to engage space and expand upon space. And so it's an exploration for me that is continual. The last thing I want to say is that African color, I used to even think of this concept as believable at one time. And I had a project where earlier on I was thinking, I want to deal with African color in my paintings. But when I started doing the wall installations, I was like, okay. And then I started looking at really a lot of textiles, like mass production textiles. I started to see like there's no such thing as African color, that it's any color. And you might have rituals and cultures where they use specific things or do specific things that have specific color to them, but that's not the only thing that identifies a culture's color sensibility. It's to see that color is everything and anything. And look at the Sistine Chapel, and when it was cleaned, and you'll see maybe Disney in the ceiling, Disney color in the ceiling, for example. Or you think about classical sculpture, in that it wasn't this white patina of cement or whatnot, but they were painted, and they were painted in drag queen-like color. And so we get to understand that, as artists, you talk to artists, you talk to people who love art, you talk and you engage, and you think about it, you learn so much every single day. And it's a never-ending exploration of study. Yeah.
Hi there. So you did reference jazz, and I see potentially some references to the sonic in your titles too. And I feel that in the realm of the abstract, sometimes the vibration of color and the vibration of sound can become very closely paralleled. I'd love to know if there are, for you, either any very direct influences from the sonic, or whether you see intersections between the sound and the work that you do.
Yeah, I would say all the above. I mean, definitely music is super important to me. And a lot of people say I have eclectic taste of music, I love all sorts of music, but I still think it's kind of specific. And as we look at people's musical taste, you can kind of still frame, you can still kind of shape what their interests are, even if it's whoa, vast. It's like, okay, they have a kind of compass, let's say. But for me, I learned a lot about space, listening to music from late Miles and jazz music to New York no sound, New York no music, Velvet Underground, James Brown, late funk. I was listening to a lot of this stuff just to get the idea of how space can be expansive, how space can shift. Very cultural music from, like North Africa to Middle Eastern music, Indian music, just explorations of classical music. It's the idea of space and sound is similar to color in space and the sound that a color can make and the physicality of how you can understand and receive color. Yeah. So, but dance does that for me. Other things like that too. Cinema, watching movies. Yeah.
You said something about in abstraction you get caught up in language also, as well as in figurative art. And I'd love to hear you speak more about that as an artist who's worked as a writer and editor. I'm finally getting away from words because on some level words fail me where art doesn't. So I would just love to hear you say more about what your thoughts on that were.
I mean, it's like we need words to communicate, and you need ideas to communicate things amongst each other. But you can also understand the power that exists in the idea of words, the history behind words, and the connotations of like say power relations, or who is dominant and who is submissive in the relationship, or these kinds of things. And I've become more sensitive to those kinds of things over the years in the ways in which we can construct, like, say, racist or sexist ideologies with language, how laws have been, like ideas behind laws that were like very sexist and racist, let's say, and how they utilized ideation with language to be able to maintain and enhance ugliness, let's say. And so for me, it's interesting to think about, like, I'm very interested in the dynamic of like transgendering and the idea of being able to go beyond the language, the words of he, she, he, him, she, her. And I fumble myself when I'm trying to engage that literally when I say her or they. But for me, it's a real strong move to understand the binding nature of language, where it does and can limit so harshly. And then when somebody is trying to indicate they, them versus he, she, what are they actually trying to escape? And not that it's about just becoming the other side of something, but the idea of escaping the container of language. And then I'm looking at it at life in the sense of, are we looking at, we pass through life, we live and then we die. How do we let go of grief? How do we, because I have aging parents and I'm thinking about this sort of stuff. So like, how do we let go of them and how do we retain them? And understanding that this is a process of life. Like, is it simply the name that they're given rather than mom or dad, or is it Emmanuel, or is it Jonathan, or is it James? And what the power of that is, because James might connote, let's say Ifani, my daughter's name is Ifani. Men and women may have this name in Igbo culture. And and in Western culture, you have names that can escape this kind of thing. But the idea that the person is founded in a name, and then in that name you get the energy and spirit of that person, you realize that, there is life beyond life. You can think of your past and say, you can think of their name, say their name, call them by their name, and you get the rush of who they are gets brought to you. And then you realize that that is the goal, in a sense, to be able to go beyond those the containers that we have, the constructs that we live with that limit us in what we can be. And there's where I feel like, oh, that's potentially, it helps me to escape the grief of loss. If I'm only saying that they're here and then they're not here, versus when I call them by their name. Yeah.
I hate to say this, but I think we just have time for one more question from the audience.
So I'm interested in this process of how the idea of representation interacts with the art of painting. Do you begin with an idea that something that you want to represent and focus the application of the paint to address that? Is it something that you come to after you've completed the painting, or is it something that's interactive in the course of the painting itself?
Sometimes I just see drawings sitting there by accident that are maybe 5 years old and they're piled on top of each other, and I see something in them that I didn't see at the time I made the drawing. And that's how a painting will start. Or basically something like that. I just see something or feel something or in a dream or something, whatever. I'm always kind of working in a way, looking at things and looking at colors wherever I travel. Even when I try to sleep, something might happen, or where I'm just, noticing things. It's about noticing things for me. And so the idea that, I'm going to have an idea and then make the idea that's the problem of picture making. And when artists are picture makers, then that's just like, again, the construct thing of the idea is already there and it's just illustrating the thing. But it's kind of an amazing. This is why it's so hard to be an artist, because it's really you go through the process of finding something. You get to, something comes to you, you understand it in a new way, and then you make it and you realize it. And then everybody congratulates with you, that thing. Then the stress comes like, oh my God, can I do that again? And that is super problematic, really can be crippling. You just have to let it go and just play again. And that's where the old axiom of Picasso learned to play when he was 90 or something. As a child he did this, and then when he's old he learned to play. I forget the idea, the phrasing, but the thing is that kids are fearless, absolutely, to their demise. That's why they need parents or things like people like this to help them, to guide them. But they're fearless, and the thing is, when we build up all these ideas and notions of correctness and whatnot, they can stifle us and stop us from being able to take the risk again of just being able to find something and then make something from the finding. And that's part of one aspect of, and one important aspect of being an artist. Yeah.
It's a nice note to end on. Thank you both so much. Thank you all for coming.